The Low Countries were never supposed to be the center of a revolution. They were small, flat, and quiet, a collection of provinces under the heavy hand of the Spanish Empire, the strongest power on earth. But beneath the neat canals, painted houses, and merchant wealth, pressure was building. Religious tension, taxation, oppression, and a king who believed rebellion was something that should be burned out, not negotiated with. In the mid-1500s, the Dutch lived under the rule of Philip II of Spain, a monarch who saw the world in absolutes, Catholic or heretic, loyal or traitor, order or chaos. His empire stretched from Madrid to Mexico, from Naples to the Philippines. And he guarded it with iron discipline, brutal justice, and a deep distrust of anything that smelled like freedom. But the northern provinces were different. They had a long tradition of independence, of local councils and merchant power. They didn't bow easily. As Protestant ideas spread across Europe, the Dutch embraced them, not only as faith, but as defiance, and Philip responded with the only language he understood: violence. In 1566, the tension snapped. Protestant mobs shattered Catholic statues, smashed altars, and tore apart churches in a frenzy called the Iconoclastic fury. It wasn't just religion. It was rage. A rejection of foreign rule. A spark that lit the fuse. Philip II answered by sending in one of the most feared commanders in Europe, the Duke of Alva. He marched into the Low Countries with Spanish Tercios, elite infantry, unmatched in discipline and cruelty. Wherever Alva went, gallows rose behind him. His infamous Council of Blood executed thousands. Nobles were arrested, land seized, and families shattered. The message was clear: resistance was death. But fear doesn't always create obedience. Sometimes it creates heroes. From German exile, a nobleman named William of Orange, known later as William the Silent, became the quiet leader of a desperate rebellion. He wasn't a firebrand. He wasn't a conqueror. He was something more: dangerous, patient, calculated, determined. The kind of man who could lose a dozen battles and still return the next year with another army. His early attempts to invade the Netherlands failed miserably. Alva crushed every uprising, burned every village, and hunted rebels like animals. But something unexpected was happening beneath the surface. The Dutch were learning to endure. They fought like the land itself, stubborn, wet, and impossible to break. When Spanish armies advanced, the Dutch opened the dikes and flooded the fields. Whole landscapes disappeared beneath water. Roads vanished. Caverns turned to lakes. Spanish soldiers found themselves fighting ghosts in a drowned world. It was a weapon only the Netherlands could wield: the ocean itself. As Alva's terror continued, rebel groups known as the Sea Beggars took to the water. They were pirates, smugglers, and freedom fighters combined into one. They raided Spanish ships, seized towns along the coast, and turned the North Sea into a battleground. Their capture of the town of Brielle in 1572 transformed the rebellion. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. Spain could bleed. More provinces rose in revolt. Cities declared loyalty to William of Orange, and for the first time, Spain realized it wasn't facing a small uprising. It was facing a nation being born. But Spain did not let its empire fracture easily. More armies were sent. More blood poured into the soil. Entire cities were besieged, starved, or massacred. The worst came at Haarlem, where defenders held out for months against overwhelming force. They fought in frozen canals, on rooftops, and inside collapsing walls. But when the city finally fell, Spanish soldiers unleashed horrors that scarred the war forever. Yet even defeat couldn't break Dutch resolve. Their resistance hardened, their identity sharpened. What began as scattered rebellion was turning into revolution. By the late 1570s, the northern provinces agreed on something unthinkable for the time: the right to choose their own ruler. With the Union of Utrecht, they formed the basis of a new nation, And in 1581, they did the unthinkable. They declared independence from Spain. The Dutch Republic was born. Spain answered with fury, but this time the war was changing. The Tercios, once unstoppable, were now facing a new kind of enemy. A nation of engineers, merchants, and sailors who rebuilt every city, fortified every river, and fought not for kings, but for themselves. The battlefield had shifted, and so had the balance of power. This was no longer a rebellion. It was the beginning of a new world. Spain was not an empire that forgave humiliation. When the Dutch declared independence in 1581, Philip II took it as a personal insult, a wound to his honor, his authority, and his faith. He answered the rebellion with overwhelming force. But even the strongest empire can bleed. And in the Low Countries, Spain wasn't just bleeding, it was drowning. After the fall of Haarlem, Spain expected the Netherlands to collapse. Instead, resistance spread like wildfire. Dutch cities strengthened their defenses, drilling militias, reinforcing gates, and building star-shaped fortresses, an innovation the world had never seen. The Dutch didn't just fortify, they reinvented siege warfare. But the storm of violence reached its peak in 1576, with the event that terrified even Spain's allies, the Spanish Fury. After months without pay, thousands of Spanish soldiers mutinied. They turned their hunger and rage toward Antwerp, the richest city in northern Europe. What followed was a nightmare. The gates were breached, streets turned into rivers of fire, homes were looted, churches desecrated, civilians slaughtered without distinction. When the smoke finally lifted, 8,000 people were dead, and Antwerp, the jewel of the Low Countries, was a burned-out carcass. The Spanish Fury didn't crush the rebellion. It did the opposite. It united even loyal provinces against Spain. Catholic and Protestant alike recoiled in horror and demanded change. For the first time, the Netherlands stood together. But unity alone wouldn't win the war. Spain still had the greatest infantry in Europe, the dreaded Spanish Tercios. Their pikes and muskets, their discipline and formations, had crushed enemies from Italy to North Africa. Facing them head-on had already cost the Dutch countless lives. The rebels needed a miracle. Instead, they engineered one. When the Spanish besieged Leiden in 1574, the city was starving. Disease spread, corpses piled in the streets. Despair seeped into every home. But the Dutch played a card no European nation had ever dared to use. They opened the dikes. Fields, farms, and entire villages were sacrificed. Water surged across the land, swallowing Spanish trenches and drowning entire companies. When the sea beggars sailed over what used to be farmland, bringing food and soldiers, Leiden was saved, not by armies but by the sea itself. Spain had always fought on land. The Dutch turned the water into a weapon. Philip II grew increasingly frustrated. Every victory created more rebellion. Every defeat spread the fire. And then, in 1584, Spain struck at the heart of the revolution. A Catholic fanatic assassinated William of Orange, the man who united the provinces, the calm voice in the storm, the rebel icon. The Dutch were shaken. The rebel army lost its political backbone. The Spanish saw their chance to crush the uprising once and for all. And, for a moment, it worked. Spanish General Alessandro Farnese, the Duke of Parma, was brilliant, charismatic, and relentless. Under his command, city after city fell. Ghent, Bruges, Brussels. He rebuilt loyalty with diplomacy, crushed resistance with siegecraft, and moved across the Low Countries like a surgeon dissecting a nation. By the late 1580s, it seemed Spain would finally restore order. The rebellion appeared broken. But history loves a plot twist, and this war was full of them. Because while Spain poured its strength into the Netherlands, another crisis was erupting. England. Philip II, furious at English interference and tempted by the idea of conquering a Protestant rival, launched the Spanish Armada in 1588, the largest fleet Europe had ever seen. It was supposed to be unstoppable. Instead, it was massacred by storms, English fire ships, and bad luck. Spain lost ships, Spain lost men. Most importantly, Spain lost momentum. The Dutch seized that moment and transformed their revolt into something greater, a nation with a navy strong enough to challenge empires. The sea beggars evolved into the Dutch navy, and suddenly Spain's supply lines, coastal fortresses, and troop transports were all under threat. The tide had turned, literally and militarily. The war was no longer about survival. It was becoming a fight for dominance. And the Dutch were just getting started. Spain had once seemed invincible. The Tercios were legendary, standing walls of pikes and muskets that had crushed every army they faced for a century. But the war had dragged on for decades, and the Dutch were evolving faster than Spain could react. The young Dutch Republic began forging a new kind of military machine under a man who understood something revolutionary. War wasn't just about bravery or numbers, it was about discipline, geometry, and timing. His name was Maurice of Nassau. Maurice wasn't a charismatic warrior like William of Orange. He was a strategist, precise, methodical, almost cold in his logic. He studied ancient Roman drill manuals. He dissected the failures and successes of the Italian wars. And he realized something terrifying for Spain. The Tercio wasn't unbeatable. It was just outdated. Maurice introduced drill routines so strict they looked like choreography. Soldiers trained daily, marching in perfect rhythm, rotating ranks of musketeers and synchronizing volleys to create constant fire. No gaps, no chaos, just pure mechanical precision. Instead of huge tercio blocks that moved like boulders, Maurice created flexible formations, smaller companies that could snap together or break apart fluidly. Each unit moved like a gear in a machine. Where Spain's armies fought like knights of the past, the Dutch fought like engineers of the future. And then came the weapon that completed the revolution, the flintlock musket. It fired faster, more reliably, and with less training than the old matchlock. Combined with Dutch discipline, it turned their infantry into something Europe had never seen. A modern army capable of firing in rolling waves, reloading in rhythm, and maneuvering in ways the lumbering tercios couldn't match. The transformation was so dramatic that observers began calling Maurice's army the clockwork troops. They moved like time itself. Spain soon felt the shift. Cities that had resisted for years finally began to fall. Breda, Deventer, Zutphen, Hulst. Not just through brute force, but through engineering. The Dutch built trenches like architects, dug canals to shift water levels, and used flooding as a weapon with surgical precision. The siege of Breda in 1590 became legendary. Dutch troops smuggled soldiers inside the city using a peat barge hidden beneath cargo. When night fell, they emerged, opened the gates, and took the city with almost no casualties. It was war by brains, not bloodlust. Spain responded with sheer force, pouring men and silver into the conflict. But another problem was festering. The empire was going bankrupt, fighting in the Netherlands, Italy, the Mediterranean, and against England and France had stretched Spain thin. Silver from the New World vanished into war debts. Soldiers went unpaid. Mutinies erupted again and again. Yet, the war pressed on, a grinding stalemate of sieges, floods, and strategic punches. It was clear that neither side could land a final blow. The conflict was becoming a war of endurance, logistics, and economics, and in all three categories, the Dutch were gaining the upper hand. Then came the moment that shocked Europe. On fields across the Low Countries, Maurice and his innovations faced the Tercios in head-on battle. At Nieuwpoort in 1600, the Spanish veterans stood firm, confident they would break the Dutch as they always had. But the Dutch formations were too fast, too fluid. Their volleys were too synchronized, their cavalry too disciplined. The Tercios were beaten. For the first time in European history, the Invincible Spanish infantry, the pride of the empire, had been decisively defeated in open battle. It was more than a victory. It was a prophecy. The age of the Tercio was ending. The age of modern warfare had begun. The war soon shifted from survival to strategy, negotiations, alliances, and global ambition spreading across seas. By 1609, both sides were exhausted enough to sign the 12 years' truce, but even peace wasn't enough to stop what the Dutch Republic had become. They used the pause to transform themselves. They built ships, they opened trade routes, they formed the Dutch East India Company, the most powerful corporation in human history. They didn't just fight Spain, they outgrew them. When the war resumed, the balance of power was unrecognizable. Spain faced a nation richer than kingdoms, smarter than generals, and more relentless than empires. The Dutch were no longer rebels. They were becoming a global power. When the 12 years' truce began in 1609, the Dutch Republic was exhausted, scarred, and still technically rebellious. But the truce did something Spain never intended. It gave the Dutch time to evolve. While Spain limped through bankruptcy after bankruptcy, the Republic used peace as fuel, transforming itself into something new, something no empire had ever seen before. The Dutch didn't just rebuild, they reinvented themselves. Amsterdam exploded into the financial capital of Europe. Banks, stock exchanges, and merchant guilds turned the city into a machine of global trade. Wealth poured in from everywhere. Spices from Asia, tobacco from the Americas, silver from Japan, silk from India. The Dutch had figured out something revolutionary. A nation doesn't need a king to be powerful. It needs ships, it needs merchants, it needs vision. With every ship they built, their influence grew. With every trade route they opened, Spain's grip on the world slipped a little more. And the beating heart of this transformation was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the first multinational corporation, the first stock-based enterprise, the first private navy in history. It had more ships than most nations, more money than Spain's treasury, and more ambition than any court in Europe. Spain began the war fighting rebels. Now it was fighting a global empire of merchants. When the war resumed in 1621, the Dutch were no longer the terrified provinces Spain had hunted decades earlier. They had modernized their armies. Their engineers had perfected star forts. Their generals drilled soldiers with the precision of machines. Their navy dominated northern waters. And then fate intervened once more. Europe erupted into the 30 Years' War. A continent-wide inferno, Catholics versus Protestants, armies marching from Poland to France, entire regions depopulated, cities burned, starved, and erased. Spain plunged into that chaos to defend its Catholic allies. The Dutch? They watched and waited and used the distraction to strike the Spanish Empire in its softest spots. The Dutch Navy hunted Spanish treasure fleets. They seized Portuguese colonies. They captured Caribbean islands, African ports, and Indonesian spice cities. They tore at Spain's empire from across the world. Not in a single front, but everywhere. Spain was the heavyweight fighter in the ring. The Dutch were the knife-cutting tendons with every jab. By the 1630s, the Spanish Tercios, once the strongest infantry on earth, began to crumble. They were too slow, too rigid, too rooted in old doctrines. Meanwhile, Dutch tactics had spread across Europe. Swedish armies under Gustavus Adolphus adopted Dutch discipline and improved it. German princes hired Dutch officers to train their troops. Even France studied the Republic's military reforms. The world had changed and Spain was still fighting like it was 1550. But the breaking point came in 1643, not in the Netherlands but in the heart of France, the Battle of Rocroi. French forces, using Dutch-style infantry and mobile artillery, shattered the Spanish Tercio beyond recovery. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a funeral. The Tercio died that day, and with it, the myth of Spanish invincibility. Back in the Low Countries, the war's outcome was now inevitable. Spain could no longer afford it. The empire was bankrupt, its armies thinned, its fleets shattered, its colonies slipping away. The Dutch, meanwhile, were at their peak, globally rich, militarily innovative, and politically unified. The war had lasted almost a lifetime. Generations had been born and buried under its shadow. Entire cities had changed hands half a dozen times. Floods had been unleashed, armies frozen, armies starved, armies mutinied. But now finally, the end was approaching. In 1648, the Treaty of Münster was signed. Spain formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. The 80 Years' War was over. The rebels had outlasted the empire. A small, soggy, wind-beaten group of provinces had defeated the greatest power in Europe. But their victory wasn't just military, it was ideological. The Dutch proved a radical idea. A nation could be built, not on bloodlines, but on belief. Not by kings, but by people. Not through conquest, but through trade, science, and innovation. The modern world, capitalism, global commerce, professional military doctrine, religious tolerance, republican governance, was born from this war. Spain won battles, the Dutch won the future.